Hey guys, welcome to BudgetEDH. On this week's episode, we bring you Edgar Markov at a $100 budget. Edgar Markov is 3, a red, a white, and a black for a legendary creature with Eminence. Whenever you cast another vampire spell, if Edgar Markov is in the command zone or on the battlefield, create a 1/1 black vampire creature token. He has first strike and haste, and whenever he attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on each vampire you control. With Edgar's Eminence ability, we want to really stock up on as many vampires as we can in the deck. So we do have 35 plus vampires in this deck that we can play to get us some 1/1 vampire creatures onto the battlefield. And it is very important to have low converted mana cost vampires because we want to play multiple vampires in a turn to get all of those tokens onto the battlefield. And eventually we do want to get some lords down so we can pump up our vampires. And we have a couple of other ways of pumping our vampires up with different artifacts and enchantments, as well as having Edgar come down onto the battlefield and give our creatures +1/+1 counters. In Mardu, there's a lot of ways of disrupting our opponents, especially with removing permanents or creatures. So we do have a lot of those disruption elements in our deck as well. And then at the very end of the video, we'll go over a couple of cards that you can add that are non-budget to the list that will help increase the power level. And we'll also tell you about a couple cards that you can take out to replace those cards as well to make this deck as good as you can at a very low budget. Let's start out this deck tech by talking about some of the mana ramp that we include in this deck. We do want to focus on 2 converted mana cost or less mana ramp in our deck. We do want to be able to get our vampires down very quickly and also try to get Edgar down quickly so that he's able to get down and start pumping up our vampires. So first up, we have Soul Ring. It's 1 colorless for an artifact you can tap to add 2 colorless to your mana pool. And then we have 2 talismans in our deck, Talisman of Hierarchy and of Conviction. They both cost 2 colorless mana. You can tap to add a colorless to your mana pool, and then they're going to add 2 different types of mana to your mana pool and then deal 1 damage to you. Next up, we have all of the signets in these colors. We have Rakdos, Orzhov, and Boros Signet. They all cost 2 colorless mana. You can pay 1 and tap to add 2 colors to your mana pool. These are all really great. It's going to help you fix your mana and also ramp you at the same time. Then we have Felwar Stone. It's 2 colorless for an artifact. Tap to add 1 mana of any color that a land an opponent controls could produce. And then we have Heraldic Banner. It's 3 colorless for an artifact. When it enters the battlefield, choose a color. Creatures you control of the chosen color get +1/+0, and then you can add 1 mana of the chosen color to your mana pool. This card's great because you can choose black since most of the vampires in our deck are black, and then they're all going to get pumped up so you can get in some extra damage on your opponents. And then last but not least, we have Bantu's Monument. It's 3 colorless for a legendary artifact. Black creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Whenever you cast a creature spell, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. This is going to help you drain your opponents out whenever you cast those vampire spells and get a little bit of incremental damage over the course of the game. It's also going to help you with life gain too. There are a couple cards in our deck that have benefits when you gain life, and this is going to help you with that as well. Next up, let's talk about some of the interaction that we have in this deck. Now, since we're playing Mardu, there are a lot of great interaction options to choose from. So we are going to play some of the best spells that can deal with problematic permanents their opponents may play. So first up, we have Swords to Plowshares. It's a white for an instant. Exile target creature, its controller gains life equal to its power. This is one of the most cost-efficient ways of dealing with a creature in any color, and it's a really great card in this deck. And then we have Go for the Throat. It's 1 and a black for an instant, destroy target non-artifact creature. D-Spark is a new one out of War of the Spark. It's a white and a black for an instant. Exile target permanent with converted mana cost 4 or greater. This is a really efficient way of dealing with any permanent card that is more than 4 mana. And then we have Terminate. It's a black and a red for an instant. Destroy target creature. It can't be regenerated. Next up, we have Mortify. It's 1, a white and a black for an instant. Destroy target creature or enchantment. I like that you have some flexibility on this card, and you can also deal with enchantments with it or a creature if you need to. And then Utter End is a really great card. It's 2, a white and a black for an instant. Exile target non-land permanent. So this will deal with any of your opponent's permanents that you need to get rid of, except for lands, which is really great. Next up, we have a card that's going to help us protect our creatures. Since we are playing an aggro strategy with putting a lot of creatures on the board, we do want a way of protecting our creatures if our opponent's board wipes. So I did include a modal card that's going to help us with that. And that card is Boros Charm. It's a red and a white for an instant. Choose one. Boros Charm deals 4 damage to target player. Permanents you control gain indestructible until end of turn, and target creature gains double strike until end of turn. This is a really great, cheap modal card that gives you a lot of options and flexibility when you play it. Next up, let's talk about a couple of spells that we include in this deck to help us draw some cards. So first up, we have Night's Whisper. It's 1 and a black for a sorcery. You draw 2 cards and you lose 2 life. And then we have Sign in Blood. It's black for a sorcery. Target player draws 2 cards and loses 2 life. And then we have Read the Bones. It's 2 and a black for a sorcery. Scry 2, then draw 2 cards. You lose 2 life. These are some of the most efficient ways of drawing cards in black, especially since white and red don't really have great card draw options. These are some of the best ones that you can include in your deck. Next up, we have a couple of utility cards that work really well in this deck. And the first one is Skull Clamp. It's one colorless for an artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/-1. Whenever equipped creature dies, draw 2 cards and you can equip it for 1. This is one of the most broken cards in the game. And if you're playing any type of token strategy where your tokens are 1/1s, which we are in this deck, Skull Clamp is a great card to include to help you draw a ton of cards. So we can equip this onto all the vampire tokens that Edgar is going to make whenever we play vampires. And we're going to be able to draw a ton of cards off of it so we can keep playing more vampires and then keep equipping it. It's going to generate us a ton of value over the course of the game when this sits on the battlefield. And then next up we have Throne of the God Pharaoh. It's 2 colorless for a legendary artifact. At the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses life equal to the number of tapped creatures you control. This is great because we are going to be swinging in with those vampires as much as we possibly can. This is a great way of getting some additional damage into all of your opponents for how many vampires you have tapped on the battlefield. It's going to help you close out that game a lot quicker since it is harder to take out 3 opponents instead of just 1. It will close the gap for you. Next up, I want to talk about some of the cards that are going to help us with our tribal strategy. These are cards that give us a certain ability or buff for playing a tribal strategy. So first up, we have Icon of Ancestry. It's 3 colorless for an artifact. As it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Creatures you control of the chosen type get +1/+1, and then you can pay 3 and tap it. Look at the top 3 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card of the chosen type from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. This card's great. Not only does it help you pump your creatures up and get your vampires a little bit bigger so you can get in some more damage, it also helps you find more vampires, which is something that we really want in this deck, as Edgar is going to give us a vampire every time we play one. And then we have Blade of the Blood Chief. It's 1 colorless for an artifact equipment. Whenever a creature dies, put a +1/+1 counter on equipped creature. If equipped creature is a vampire, put 2 +1/+1 counters on it instead, and it has equip for 1. This card's really great because you can play it for only 1 mana, and then its equip cost is only 1 mana too. You can get this down on one of your really early drops, and it will start to grow with this card on it. And then you can always move it over to something bigger later, say if you play your Edgar Markov, so you can get a bunch of counters on him. Next up, we have Stensia Masquerade. It's 2 and a red for an enchantment. Attacking creatures you control have first strike, and whenever a vampire you control deals combat damage to a player, put a +1/+1 counter on it. It also has Madness for 2 and a red. If you discard this card, discard it into exile. When you do, cast it for its Madness cost or put it into your graveyard. That Madness ability does come up quite often since we do have a lot of ways of discarding cards in this deck. You will be able to play this for its Madness cost very frequently in this deck. And this card's just really great because it helps you get your vampires bigger whenever they deal combat damage, and it also makes blocking difficult since they do have that first strike damage as well. Next up, we have Mirror Entity. It's 2 and a white for a creature shapeshifter. It has Changeling, so this card is every creature type, including vampires. And then you can pay X. Until end of turn, creatures you control have base power and toughness XX and gain all creature types. This card is a finisher, especially in a tribal deck. It's going to pump up all your vampires really big whenever you play this card and then put some mana into it. Your vampires can get really large, and then you can swing in and start picking off your opponents one by one with this card. Next up, we have Vanquisher's Banner. It's 5 colorless for an artifact. When it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Creatures you control of the chosen type get +1/+1. Whenever you cast a creature spell of the chosen type, draw a card. This is one of the best cards in this deck. Not only does it help you pump your creatures up, card draw is something that we really need in this deck. So you are going to want to get this card onto the battlefield as quickly as possible whenever you can. It is going to help you draw a ton of cards, and it's also going to help you finish out the game a lot quicker. Next up, we're going to talk about all of the vampires that we have in this deck. Now, the primary goal of this deck is to play as many vampires as possible so that we can take advantage of Edgar Markov's ability of giving us extra vampires, and then eventually get Edgar Markov onto the battlefield and start pumping up all those vampires. And we have some other ways of pumping those vampires as well in this deck, which we talked about earlier, all the different tribal enchantments and different things that we have as well. We want to focus on vampires that have a low converted mana cost, 1 or 2, and sometimes even 3 if they have a really great ability, but we did focus mostly on 1 or 2 converted mana cost vampires. Even if they don't have the greatest stats, we do want to get them down early so we can get an extra vampire off of them. Because if you think about it, if we play a vampire for 1 mana, we're getting 2 vampires out of it. We're getting 2 power for 1, which is really great. So first up, we have Vampire of the Dire Moon. It's a black mana, it has Death Touch and Lifelink, and it's a 1/1. And then Vampire Cutthroat is also 1 black mana, and it has Skulk and Lifelink. And Skulk is really great because creatures can't be blocked by creatures with greater power. And Pulse Tracker is a black for a creature. Whenever it attacks, each opponent loses 1 life. So it's going to get in 2 damage for just 1 mana, which is really great in this deck. Next up, we have Bold Impaler. It's a red mana for a vampire that has 2 in a red. It gets +2/+0 until end of turn. Vampire Lacerator is a black for a creature. At the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life unless an opponent has 10 or less life. The great thing about this is it is a 2/2 for just 1 mana, which is awesome. And then we have Quag Vampires. It's a black for a creature with multi-kicker. You may pay an additional 1 to black any number of times as you cast this spell. And this also has Swamp Walk. Quag Vampires enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it for each time it is kicked. So this is going to scale later in the game. If you draw this card on turn 10, you can pump a bunch of mana in to make a really big vampire. Next up, we have Indulgent Aristocrat. It's a black mana for a creature with lifelink. You can pay 2 and sack a creature, put a +1/+1 counter on each vampire you control. This is the best 1 mana vampire in your deck. You can sack some of your tokens to pump up all your vampires. He's really great in this deck. Then we have Shadow Alley Denizen. It's a black mana for a creature. Whenever another black creature enters the battlefield under your control, target creature gains Intimidate until end of turn. It can't be blocked except by artifact creatures and or creatures that share a color with it. Then we have Viscera Seer. It's a black for a creature. Sacrifice a creature to scry 1. This is a really nice sack outlet in the deck. We don't have a lot of combos or anything that go with it, but it is nice to have a sack outlet. If somebody tries to take your creature, you can always sack it and get it back. Then we have Falconwrath Gorger. It's a red mana for a creature. Each vampire creature card you own that isn't on the battlefield has madness. The madness cost is equal to its mana cost. And we do have a lot of ways of discarding cards. This is really nice. You can discard a card and get some value off of it if it has madness. And then Stromkirk Noble is a red mana for a creature. It can't be blocked by humans, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, put a +1/+1 counter on it. So this is going to get really big quickly. If you get this down early in the game, it's going to start getting larger very quickly. Then we have Gouldraz Assassin. It's a black for a creature and it has level up for 1 and a black. On its first level, it's a 1/1, and on level 2, you can pay a black and tap it. Target creature gets -2/-2 until end of turn. And on level 4, you can pay a black and tap it. Target creature gets -4/-4 until end of turn. Next up, we have Gouldraz Vampire. It's a black for a creature. As long as an opponent has 10 or less life, Gouldraz Vampire gets +2/+1 and has Intimidate. And then we have Duskborn Sky Marcher. It's 1 white for a creature with flying. You can pay 1 and tap it. Target attacking vampire gets +1/+1 until end of turn. This is nice because you do get that evasion with it as well. And then we have Sky Marcher Aspirant. It's 1 white for a creature that has Ascend. If you control 10 or more permanents, you get the City's Blessing for the rest of the game. Sky Marcher Aspirant has flying as long as you have the City's Blessing. This is also a 2/1, which gives you a little bit of a better rate than some of the other 1 mana vampires that we have in this deck. Next up, we have Gifted Aetherborn. It's black for a creature with Death, Touch, and Lifelink. And then Olivia's Bloodsworn is 1 and a black for a creature with flying. It can't be blocked, and you can pay a red. Target vampire gains haste until end of turn. Next up, we have Calastria Highborn. It's black for a creature. Whenever it's put into a graveyard or another vampire you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you may pay a black. If you do, target player loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. This is a nice card to get some additional value off of your creatures that are going to die. Next up, we have Bloodseeker. It's 1 and a black for a creature. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, you may have that player lose 1 life. And then Cruel Celebrant is a white and a black for a creature. Whenever Cruel Celebrant or another creature or planeswalker you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. These are both really nice cards to get some additional damage on our opponents for whenever a creature dies or whenever a creature enters the battlefield under their control. Dusk Legion Zealot is 1 and a black for a creature. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. This is nice because it gives you an additional card whenever you play it. Next up, we have Drana's Emissary. It's 1, a white and a black for a creature with flying. At the beginning of your upkeep, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. And then Pawn of Ulamog is 1 black for a creature. Whenever it or another non-token creature you control dies, you may create a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature token. It has sack this creature, add a colorless to your mana pool. And since we do have a lot of ways to take advantage of those tokens and have them die or sacrifice them to drain our opponents out, this is a really nice card in our decks, especially since we have an aggro strategy. This will give us a ton of stuff if our creatures die to a board wipe or whatnot. Yahenni Undying Partisan is 2 and a black for a legendary creature with haste. Whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, put a +1/+1 counter on Yahenni. Sacrifice another creature and it gains indestructible until end of turn. We do have a lot of ways of dealing with creatures and killing them, and Yahenni will start to get big very quick. Next up, we have Vicious Conquistador. It's 1 black for a creature. Whenever it attacks, each opponent loses 1 life. Ruthless Cullblade is 1 and a black for a creature. It gets +2/+1 as long as an opponent has 10 or less life. And then Asylum Visitor is 1 and a black for a creature. creature at the beginning of each player's upkeep. If that player has no cards in hand, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. And this also has Madness for 1 in a black. This is a nice way of drawing some cards if your opponents are empty-handed or you're empty-handed, and you will be very frequently in this deck because all of your creatures have 1 or 2 converted mana costs. You'll be able to play multiple creatures in a turn and empty your hand out, and this will help you draw some cards when you do. And then next up we have Maverin Fane, Dusk Apostle. It's 2 and a white for a legendary creature. Whenever 1 or more non-token vampires you control attack, create a 1/1 white vampire creature token with lifelink. Important thing to note with this card is this will only give you 1 token. So if you swing with 3 creatures, you only get 1 token off of it. If you swing with 1 creature, you also get 1 token. And then Olivia, Mobilized for War, is 1 a black and a red for a legendary creature with flying. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may discard a card. If you do, put a +1/+1 counter on that creature. It gains haste until end of turn and becomes a vampire in addition to its other types. This card with Falconwrath Gorger on the battlefield is insane because you'll be able to discard your cards and then play them with Madness, and you'll be able to put +1/+1 counters on creatures and give them haste as well. Captivating Vampire is probably my favorite creature in this deck, and it's 1 black for a creature vampire. Other vampire creatures you control get +1/+1. Tap 5 untapped creatures you control, gain control of target creature, it becomes a vampire in addition to its other types. This is really nasty card if you have a ton of vampires on the battlefield. You can start taking control of your opponent's creatures and starting to get some value. And they turn into vampires too, which this will actually buff and help with your tribal theme that you're going with in this deck. Next up, we have a couple of vampires that pump up our vampires in the deck. First up, we have Legion Lieutenant. It's a white and a black for a creature. Other vampires you control get +1/+1. And then Stromkirk Captain is 1 a black and a red for a creature with first strike. Other vampire creatures you control get +1/+1 and have first strike. These are both really great in the deck. They're going to help us pump up our vampires and help us get in a lot of additional value when they're on the battlefield. And then next up, we have Cordial Vampire. It's a black for a creature. Whenever Cordial Vampire or another creature dies, put a +1/+1 counter on each vampire you control. This is another great card. If you have a sack outlet on the battlefield, you can start sacking some of your vampire tokens to pump up all your vampires and get in for a ton of damage with this card on the battlefield. Next up, we have Drana, Liberator of Malakir. It's 1 black for a legendary creature with flying and first strike. Whenever Drana, Liberator of Malakir deals combat damage to a player, put a +1/+1 counter on each attacking creature you control. This is one of the best creatures in the deck. It's going to help you pump up your vampires and get a lot of damage in very quickly when this hits the battlefield. And then last but not least, we have Blood Artist. It's 1 and a black for a creature. Whenever Blood Artist or another creature dies, target player loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. This is another really great way of draining our opponents whenever creatures die, and we do have a lot of synergy of killing creatures in our deck. Next up, let's talk about some of the non-budget upgrades that we could include in this deck to give it a little bit of a boost in the power level. So the first card I would add to this deck is Shared Animosity. It's 2 and a red for an enchantment. Whenever a creature you control attacks, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn for each other attacking creature that shares a type with it. So this is going to pump up all your vampires and make them very big for only 3 mana. So this is a really great card to include in the deck. The card that I would take out for this card would be Stensia Masquerade. It's a similar card at the same mana cost, but Shared Animosity has a way higher upside, especially if you have a lot of vampires on the battlefield that you want to attack in with. Shared Animosity is going to make them much bigger and close out the game a lot faster. The next card I would add to this deck is Anguished Unmaking. It's 1 a white and a black for an instant, and you can exile target non-land permanent, you lose 3 life. This is one of the best removal spells in the game. It gets rid of any non-land permanent for the cost of just 3 life, and it's instant speed. The card I would take out in place of this is Victim of Night. The next card I would add to this deck is Anointed Procession. It's 3 and a white for an enchantment. If an effect would create 1 or more tokens under your control, it creates twice that many of those tokens instead. With this card on the battlefield, every time you play a vampire, it's going to give you 2 vampires off of Edgar, which is a very powerful ability. And what I would take out of this deck for that would be Blade of the Blood Chief. It's a really nice card, but it's not as good as Anointed Procession in this deck. The next card I would add is Kalidas, Trader of Get. It's 2 black for a legendary creature with lifelink. If a non-token creature an opponent controls would die, instead exile that card and put a 2/2 black zombie creature token onto the battlefield. You can pay 2 and a black, sacrifice another vampire or zombie, put 2 +1/+1 counters on Kalidas. This card is very powerful. It can get you a lot of zombies very quickly. And the card I would take out in its place is Maverin Fane. And Maverin is a great card in this deck, but for 1 additional mana, the impact that Kalitas is going to have on the game is a lot larger and will help you win the game a lot faster. The next card I would add to this deck is Metallic Mimic. It's 2 colorless for an artifact creature shapeshifter. As Metallic Mimic enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Metallic Mimic is the chosen type in addition to its other types, and each other creature you control of the chosen type enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. Metallic Mimic is great. Not only does it come down as a vampire, it's going to help you pump up all your vampires over the course of the game as long as this sits on the battlefield. And the card I would take out in its place is Bloodseeker. It's the same mana cost, but has a very minimal impact compared to Metallic Mimic. And then the last upgrade I would make in this deck is Herald's Horn. It's 3 colorless for an artifact. When it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Creature spells you cast of the chosen type cost 1 less to cast, and at the beginning of your upkeep, look at the top card of your library. If it's a creature card of the chosen type, you may reveal that card and put it into your hand. This card is great. It's going to lower the casting cost of all of your vampires, and it's going to help you get card advantage as well, which is something that we do need in this deck. There's not a whole lot of card draw options, so having something like Herald's Horn in your deck is very essential to the strategy of this deck. And at only $7, it's a great card to include. The card I would take out in its place is Blood Crazed Paladin. It's a 2 mana cost vampire that has a very minimal impact on the game. You don't really want to be holding up 2 mana to play this at flash speed, so it's really going to come down as a 2 mana 1/1 most of the time. Herald's Horn is going to have a much larger impact on the game if you get it down onto the battlefield. Thank you so much for watching this Budget Deck Tech today. If you have any suggestions for some of the picks in this deck or agree with or disagree with some of the choices, let us know in the comments down below. If you like this video, consider subscribing to our YouTube channel if you haven't already, and check us out on Patreon over at patreon.com/BudgetEDH. There's a lot of different tiers for rewards over on Patreon. See you guys next time.